Well, good morning, everybody. While we're waiting for Senator Fine to join us, let's just welcome this day with gratitude for all the promise that it holds. Not just referring to this session, but the entire promise and joy this day holds for service, for thanks, for just being alive. Thank God. What a joy. So we welcome all of you today. On behalf of Winnetka Congregational Church, I want to welcome State Senator Laura Fine, who represents I believe, the 9th
Yep.
for the state of Illinois. We are so very pleased and honored to have you with us to help us have a perspective on what's going on at the state level with environmental justice. And I'm going to turn it over to Sister Liz Kunkel right now to proper introduction to Senator Fine.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And thank you again, Senator Fine, for joining us. Before I even start my intro, I'm going to ask you a quick question, which is, how would you like us to refer to you in this meeting? We joked last week with Representative Caston that the proper way to refer to him would be the Right Honorable Representative Caston. So what title do you prefer or none?
I prefer Laura.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura.
And Liz, may I jump in again and remind people
Yes.
to please mute yourselves during the conversation today, and then unmute yourself when there's an opportunity for questions. Please feel free to put your thoughts and questions in the chat. That's a good way for us to curate those and then present them at that time. Liz, back to you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So as Jeffrey mentioned, Laura, State Senator Fine Laura, is serving her first full term as our state senator for the 9th District in Illinois, for those of you who live in Winnetka or otherwise in the 9th District. This area encompasses mostly Chicago's northern suburbs. Laura chairs the Behavioral and Mental Health Committee. She's vice chair of the Human Services Committee, and she's a member of the Environment and Conservation and many other committees. Prior to serving in the Senate, Laura served as the state representative for the 17th District for 6 years. Her legislative focus has been on consumer protection in healthcare, mental health, environment, and youth and young adults. Prior to being elected to the state legislature, Laura was an instructor in the political science department at Northeastern Illinois University, and she served as the clerk of Northfield Township. Laura holds a BA in telecommunications from Indiana University, an MA in political science from Northeastern Illinois University, and is a graduate of the Illinois Women's Institute for Leadership, the Council of State Government's Toll Fellowship Program, the Bao He Institute for Legislative Leadership Development, and the Edgar Fellows Program. She also serves on the board of the Legislative Committee of the Interstate Insurance Product Regulation Commission, Emerging Adult Justice Learning Community, Illinois Childhood Cancer Research, CSG Healthy States National Task Force, the Subcommittee on Intervention to Save Lives, and the Executive Committee of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. Locally, and in her spare time, Laura is a member of the Kiwanis Club of Glenview Northbrook, the Rotary Club of Glenview Sunrise, and the Glenview Glencoe League of Women Voters. Laura lives in Glenview with her husband, Michael, and their 2 sons. Again, welcome, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us. Seriously, obviously, you are clearly very busy, so really it means so much that you're here with us this morning.
Well, thank you so much. And I think, Liz, if I'm not mistaken, I think the first time we met was marching for the environment. How many years ago was that in the city?
It was true. It was 2017. It was true. It was at the March for Science. We were marching and I had a Go Green Winnetka sign, and Laura came over and she's like, "Are you with Go Green Winnetka? You guys have a coal tar ban. We love you." It was the best.
Very exciting, because I actually, for the first time after 7 years, got a coal tar bill through the Senate. And I think we're going to get it done. Not as much as I want, but baby steps. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. I know many of these faces here today are familiar to me. I wish I could see everybody in person, but hopefully that's soon. And Liz, I love the outside background, the purple tree. It's perfect.
It was perfect timing.
I'm telling you, it bloomed right on time. So we are really busy in the General Assembly right now. We came back into regular session. I'm going to say regular session in parentheses because we've been back since March, but it doesn't look like what it usually looks like in the Capitol. Usually this time of year, we've got hundreds of people milling around. Now we do not. The Senate has been back, like I said, since March. The House is now first meeting in session these past couple weeks. And it's quite interesting because we have to go down on Mondays to get COVID tested and show a negative result before they'll let us into the Capitol. So this is what's keeping so many people away right now. But eventually we will get back into normalcy. We're taking baby steps. Nonetheless, we are in the final month of our session, which means now everything is kind of blooming. And we're going to see where everything turns out. So today we're talking about what's being done for environmental justice. Justice has been sort of a theme in the General Assembly since last summer. Last summer, after all the Black Lives Matters marches, the Illinois General Assembly sat down and said, okay, how can we answer to this? Because it's not just criminal justice reform. There's a whole lot of reform that has to be done. So as of last week, the final pillar of the Black Caucus was signed, and these pillars are all having to do with justice and equality. So we passed the criminal justice reform pillar, the education pillar, the employment pillar, and just last week, the healthcare pillar was signed. And all these pillars have to do, like I said, with social justice and equality so that everybody rises together. I think, what is the term? And I'm so bad with remembering terms, but a high tide lifts all boats, if I got that right. And so that's what we've been working on. So now that we've gotten the pillars passed, we're looking at a lot of environmental justice. What can we do to make sure that we have safety in our environment, justice in our environment, and a fair path for everybody going forward? So just a few items that I'm going to mention, and then we'll open it up to questions. The big item on the agenda this year, is CEJA. Which is a follow-up to FEJA. So if you're not familiar, FEJA was the Future Energy Jobs Act, and that put a big spotlight on renewable energy in the state of Illinois. And what the ironic part of that piece of legislation was, I'm part of a national group called the National Council of Environmental Legislators. And after we passed FEJA, I went to one of our meetings. And usually when you come from Illinois, you were always kind of like, what's going to come up? Are they going to say something bad about Illinois? Well, I walked in the room and all they could do was gush about the legislation that we had passed in the state of Illinois and how that had become a landmark piece that every state wants to try to pass and live up to. Well, it went so well in the state of Illinois that now we're working on the follow-up legislation, which is CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act. That bill is sort of, I want to say it's a piece of clay right now, and it continues to be molded because every day it changes a little bit. So we have a bill that came from the legislature and the environmental groups. Then we had a bill that came out of labor. And just last week, we had a bill that came out of the governor's office. So now all the groups are sitting down and working together saying, how can we do this? How can we get it passed? There are a few topics that I just want to hit on that are in the bill that are very important. Part of the bill has to do with ethics and accountability. Sunset for formula rates would happen immediately. That's an important piece of it. We want to require an annual Exelon audit because we know that we got in a little trouble if you're an energy company this year, and we want to make sure they're held accountable. And we want to increase the transparency around the Citizens Utility Board. So that's all part of the ethics and accountability piece. There are also consumer protections put into CEJA. This would increase ComEd and Ameren's annual commitment to low-income energy efficiency programs to better support low-income households, because that is so important right now, especially after coming out of this pandemic. So many families were hit so hard. What can we do as a state to make sure that they are protected? We want to eliminate customer deposits and late fees for low-income utility residential customers, and eliminate all payment fees for all online payment fees for all customers. So anyway, in other words, if you were to pay your bill online, you wouldn't be charged that convenience fee, because we're saying, okay, that's not fair. And we want to require utility companies to accurately report to the ICC on the number of shutoffs and reconnections to provide low-income discount rates for customers, and expand the LIHEAP eligibility. So that's a little bit about the consumer protection piece. When it comes to renewable energy and labor standards, this puts the state on a path towards 100% clean energy towards 2050. And that's something that I know I personally find so exciting. But we are from an area where we focus on clean energy. The big concern is in Southern Illinois, where coal is still king. And we have to keep that in mind as we move forward. So as part of this legislation, not only are we focusing on the clean energy, but we are focusing on transition and workforce development, to make sure that people who are in these coal areas can realize that, hey, you know, we've been living on coal, but there are many more job opportunities out there. And those job opportunities are going to be better jobs, safer jobs, and clean energy jobs. So we don't want people to feel like they're being cut off, that we want the whole state to feel like they're a part of this. So just a few more things about the Clean Power and Air. It dedicates funds to programs that benefit equity investment in eligible communities, communities with a high poverty rate and a disproportionate of health impacts that are attributed to what was once clean or dirty energy. So there is a big focus on the communities that have been hit the hardest when it comes to this. And we also want equity in the clean energy economy and a focus on energy efficiency. I know that is just a quick summary of what a really large bill is hoping to do. But now we're coming to the table and everything's going to be hammered out. So Friday was the first big meeting when the governor brought out what his proposal is going to be. And now all the groups are sitting down and really looking at the fine print and making sure that everything that we're looking at is looked at through an equitable lens and a clean energy lens. So it'll be interesting to see what happens by the end of May, because that's when everything sort of exposes itself. We talk about the end of May as kabuki theater, because we work, and then all of a sudden at the end of May, the kabuki theater happens and everything, you know, has a result and we get it done. So that's a little bit about what's happening with the Clean Energy Jobs Act. There are a number of pieces surrounding what are we going to do with food scraps. And I know Liz texted or emailed me, gosh, I don't know how many months ago, to say, hey, we need a resolution talking about what we're going to do with food waste. And so we have a resolution now talking about composting in the state of Illinois. And that resolution has been introduced, and we are going to get that one out there and make sure people realize that composting will save so much space in our landfills, and that this is something that we can get done. So this sends a message to everybody that if you have an idea for a piece of legislation, let me know, because we can get it done together. Ironically, another piece of legislation that I started working on last year came from the Go Green groups in our community, and that was to ban the use of gas-powered leaf blowers. Totally makes sense, in my opinion, not so well received throughout the state. So this year, we're going to start with an educational resolution on gas-powered leaf blowers and see where we can go from there. I want to talk a little bit about the coal tar legislation that I passed. For those who are in the Go Green groups, you know that I've been working on banning coal tar for about 7 years now. And anybody who's ever worked on this, even at the community level, knows that industry comes after you and they don't want to get this done. So my original piece of legislation was a complete ban of coal tar, and that went over like a hunk of coal tar, I guess you could say. Very important and necessary in our communities, and many of our groups latched onto that, and we are so fortunate now because in many of our communities we have a coal tar ban. However, that did not, like I said, go over so well in the entire part of the state. So I have been working on legislation for many years to see where we can finally get an agreement. And I've had many arguments with industry because they've come in and said, no, we're not going to do it. And I finally said to them last year, I'm just not taking no for an answer. You need to come with me with a solution, and we're going to get a solution done. So to my great surprise this year, about a month or so ago, somebody from the chemical industry came into my office and said, we know how persistent you are. You're not giving this up. Here's our idea how we can move forward. And so although this is not a complete ban, what it does say is if you are a school or a government agency and you need to do repaving, you have to look into both. If you're going to look into coal tar, you have to look into a non-carcinogenic alternative and compare pricing. And whatever you decide to do, you need to put that information up on your website, so people know what you're going to be using, and if they feel like it's a safe or a dangerous product that they're going to use, they can give you feedback. And they can always, especially in the schools, if you're going to use coal tar, parents can say, well, I'm not going to send my kids to school for those days because it's not a safe environment for them to be playing in. I have a question. What is coal tar? And I apologize because I've been living with coal tar for so many years. So coal tar is, if you've ever walked past somebody's house and they're blacktopping their driveway and your eyes start watering and it smells like your nose is going to fall apart because that stench is so awful, that's coal tar. And studies have shown that coal tar is carcinogenic. Coal tar is not sold. If you go to Ace Hardware or Lowe's or Home Depot, they will not sell it, but you can buy it in bulk. And a lot of these paving companies will purchase coal tar because it's a cheaper alternative. But what we have found and what the pediatricians have found is coal tar is carcinogenic, especially to children. And what industry will tell you is, oh, once it's down, it's not carcinogenic, all those qualities are gone, except for the fact that the coal tar dust is. And kids will play on the playground and then bring that dust into their homes. And we know that there's runoff because every couple of years you've got to repave your driveways or your blacktops or your basketball courts. And in many states and many communities, what they found is the coal tar runs off and gets into the waterways, and it costs millions of dollars to get it out of the water, and it's very harmful to the environment in the water. So this is something that I've been working on for many years, and I know that if nothing else, the education that people have received as a result of this have been tremendous. Like I said, it has been banned in Wilmette, in Glenview, in Evanston, I know Glencoe would like to ban it, except they're non-home rule, and that brings about other issues. So it's an issue that's really come to the forefront. And people always say, nothing ever dies in Springfield. If it's something really important to you, you've got to continue to fight for it. So if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to answer more questions about that. We're also working on lead service line replacement. And that's something that's very important to the federal government too, which would be extremely helpful because the one thing that's really holding us up on this legislation is the cost. And most communities cannot afford the cost of replacing lead service lines. And especially in Illinois, in the low-income communities, this is where we're hit the most. And so if we could get federal dollars in to help cover those costs, that would be a life changer when it comes to the lead service lines. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions because I was told 15 minutes, and I think I'm just about there. And I'm sure there's many questions out there because I speak very quickly.
And it's so interesting. That's so great, Laura. Thank you so much for sharing. I don't know, you answered a lot of my questions already in terms of what's going on and how it was wonderful. It was a great overview of, and I love hearing that there was sort of new energy behind this last summer, because I know Go Green and other groups that my employer, Collective Resource Compost, started an environmental justice discussion group. It's not just a book group. It's it's movie but there's this energy around it. And so thank you so much for reflecting and sharing with us that that's happening at our state level too. It's not just grassroots that's really taking hold. So thank you so much. Steve, I know I know you fell off and fell back in. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Do you want to ask some of the questions from the chat? Can you?
Yeah, I think there are two related questions that have come in so far about the CEJA legislation, and they both have to do with nuclear power. So maybe you could just talk about nuclear power, but the questions relate to how is it included and considered, given that some of the opposition to nuclear power from the scientific community has changed over time. And then the second part of that question relates to subsidies. How are subsidies for the nuclear power industry considered in the legislation? And Paul and Chuck, you both can jump in on refining those as Senator Fine speaks.
Right. And I will be honest with you, for some of these answers, I don't know what the answer is yet. In the past, we have had subsidies for nuclear. What we're looking at right now is, were those subsidies equitable, or were we giving too much? And what is going to happen with nuclear power? When it comes to nuclear, it's so interesting because nuclear is a form of clean energy. However, a couple of years ago, I was able to go on an energy tour in Germany, where they're working towards 100% renewable way before we are, and they are on the right track there. And kind of a funny story, because we were having a meeting with some of their energy experts, and my question to them was, their prices of energy in Germany as a result of this transition have increased. And so I said, well, how did you get people to buy into this if their energy prices are going up so much? And they said, well, we all believe in climate change. So people were willing to take that plunge. But now here's the irony. They're working to close all their nuclear plants. They still remember Chernobyl, and people are really gun shy when it comes to nuclear in Europe as a result of that. So they still have coal plants that they're using, and they're shutting down within these next couple of years all their nuclear plants. We kind of look at that a little bit differently because many of our nuclear plants are still up and running, and much of the energy in Illinois right now depends on nuclear. So going forward, I don't know how many years are left in those nuclear plants before they're going to have to be disassembled. So that's something that we're going to be looking at in CEJA, and what is the cost of that going to be? And are we better off funding the plants to keep them open for, as long as their lives can keep them open? So that's something that the green groups are looking into right now, and I don't have any definitive answers.
Okay. There was a question about wind turbines.
Can I interrupt a minute?
Sure, Paul.
Steve, I'm sorry. Yeah, my question was more generally how the cost of environmental legislation is considered in the process. Now, how do you balance the additional cost against the positive effects of clean energy? Is there a process for each step that the legislature takes where you have to look at the ultimate cost either to the consumer or through taxes or whatever versus the benefit that's gained?
There is, because we have to make sure that as we move towards clean energy, it doesn't price everybody out of being able to afford energy. So we have to see what can the consumer afford. unlike Germany, where they were able to raise all their prices, we would have people with pitchforks outside of our homes if we were to do that in Illinois. So we really have to look at where the investment can be and how it saves money down the line. The big piece of that is the jobs piece. Because of the fact that so many of the jobs, especially in coal, would be eliminated. So we have to make sure economically that it doesn't have a negative impact on certain parts of the state. So that has to be weighed in on everything that we're doing. So each part of the legislation has to take a look at what are the economics of that part. And I know for some of my colleagues, they would be all in, except for if the economics are bad, they're out. So it's a very difficult balancing act, but we got it done in FEJA, and I think we can get it done in CEJA as well.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a comment and a question actually adding on to that. One of the deficiencies in earlier cost-benefit analysis has been the failure to recognize externalities, often externalities that played out harmfully in economically challenged areas of our state and of our communities around Chicago. So are those externalities being included in these economic analyses also?
They are. And in many ways, they're being looked at in two ways. One, how can we bring like affordable community solar to these areas so you can sell back to the grid? And another is looking at investing in jobs in these communities. And after we passed the 4 pillars of the Black Caucus, that even highlighted how important bringing jobs into these communities is. And so that is a big focus of the legislation and how we can get that done. The unions have been active in this new piece of legislation with the governor's office, and our Black Caucus is on top of them saying, that's great, we want these good union jobs, but we want these good union jobs in these particular communities because this is going to help us rise. And so that message is being heard loud and clear.
Very good. Well, this power theme we're on seems to be playing of great interest to all of that have joined this morning. Another question relates to wind turbines in Illinois. And specifically, is there any talk of having wind turbines on Lake Michigan?
Robin Gable and I had a bill a couple of years ago to put together a task force to kind of study what that would look like. I don't see that as a highlight in this particular bill right now, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be come May, because that is an issue. And something, okay, I'm going to put a plug in for my son right now. He's graduating from school and he's going to be working on his PhD, and his PhD is focusing on renewable energy in the water. So he tried to explain it to me, but it's like using kites underwater with the flow of the current to create energy for the grid. So even though we're looking at possibility of, can we put wind turbines in Lake Michigan, there's research going on right now to look at other ways we could use water to form that energy. And we need this younger generation because they've got the ideas that hopefully we'll be bringing forward.
Very good. And then let's take one on solar. Junie asks about any plans for solar panels on rooftops, especially in apartment type buildings.
Yeah, I do believe that was part of the original CEJA bill coming out of the environmentalists, because what we heard of was a lot of people who were kind of frustrated because they lived in condos or apartments and they weren't able to use solar power. And so we're trying to correct that.
Okay, very good. Laura, you mentioned, or I believe Liz mentioned in your intro, that you serve on a Great Lakes Legislative Council, is that right?
Correct.
So I don't know much about that, but I'm very interested in water quality and protection of the Great Lakes. Maybe you could speak a little bit about how that council is working towards those ideas.
Absolutely. So I've been part of this organization for about 7 years now, and it's through the Council of State Governments. It's the Great Lakes Legislative Council, and we are made up of lawmakers from all the Great Lakes states and the provinces in Canada. And we have monthly, now they're Zoom meetings, and we try to meet together at least once a year, and our focus is on the Great Lakes and keeping the Great Lakes clean. And so right now, the big issue that we're working on now is erosion. And what can we do to pass legislation in all of our states that would protect our Great Lakes from erosion? We've also looked at from like blue blooms and algae to, how do we impact zebra mussels, to what can we do to protect the lakes and keep them clean? It's kind of ironic because the running joke amongst us is we have to make sure our lakes are up and running and pristine, because soon everybody's going to be wanting to move into the Great Lakes states because we're going to have that clean water supply. And so that's really what our focus is. And I learned about coal tar from this organization many years ago, because Minnesota was one of the first states to ban coal tar. So we are working on any pieces of legislation that will protect our lakes. And it is a fabulous organization. I've been on the executive committee for a couple of years. Robin Gable is now the chair of the Great Lakes Caucus. So in Illinois, we're really focusing on it.
Okay. You mentioned people might be wanting to move here to take advantage of these fabulous water resources. Another approach might be to tap into those waters and move them elsewhere, as has, those are ideas that have been afoot here over the decades. Thoughts about protections?
Yeah, I'm going to fight to protect our waters. Yeah, somebody, one of our meetings, this was years ago, they talked about how, these big container ships want to come in and take our water. We're going to be very protective of our waterways, share where we need to share, but we need to make sure that they're here and that we don't do anything that's going to harm them.
I wanted to look back to the rest of the group that's assembled. If you've got a question, haven't had a chance to get it into the chat, maybe you could just raise your hand and jump in and ask. While you're thinking, what?
Eleanor?
Was that Eleanor?
You're muted, Eleanor.
That's something that we all do.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I read somewhere that Germany is now 26% reliant on renewable energy. And I know we have a number of wind farms in the state of Illinois. I haven't seen any solar farms, but then I haven't been looking for them. I know that the wind farms that we have in Illinois have been selling their energy to other states such as Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. Can you tell me what % do we have any wind and solar energy in the state of Illinois that we are actually using in the state, which is not just used by local communities, and how many local communities are using wind or solar power energy in the state of Illinois?
I don't have those numbers. That's a really good question. If you email me that question, I will be able to get an answer for you, but I don't have it at my fingertips. It's something that's growing. We are in a good space for wind energy, and we've got the tools in place for it, but I don't know the percentages and the number of communities that are using it right now. It was interesting because one of the places that I visited in Germany was a farming village, and I can't remember what the name of the energy producer is called, but they used all the manure from the farms to create all the energy for the grid in this particular village. So they have figured out how to find a source that is going to be there forever and make it into energy. And it's amazing the things that can be done.
Hey, Greg, I missed your question, unfortunately, while I was offline. So maybe you could just ask it directly.
Sure. I thought I saw something in the bill, Laura, about schools using electric school buses as soon as possible and solar panels on the roofs of all the public schools in the state. Would that, I mean, because there are, Democratic majorities in both houses, and it would probably, benefit schools across the state. What do you hear as the substance of the naysayers, or why would someone be against something like that? Because it would also create a lot of jobs.
Yeah, it would come down to cost. How much is that going to cost? I know I have a school in my area, Sunset Ridge, that has solar panels, and they had a 5-year contract for selling back to the grid, and they were receiving a certain discount as a result of it. But after the 5 years, that contract is up. And so they're not getting the savings that they thought they were going to anymore. So this is something that really has to be hammered out. I would love to see electric school buses. As anybody knows who's ever been stuck behind a school bus, it's not a pleasant experience, but it's going to boil down to cost.
May I,
Thank you.
sorry, a quick PS on the electric bus issue. So apart from legislation, Greg, coincidentally, I just heard yesterday or 2 days ago that as part of the I believe it's the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, that basically there's there are funds available for converting bus fleets to a school bus fleets to electric, but it's not legislative. It's like grant money that's available. It was just announced this week.
Oh, thank
So
you. I didn't see
The
that.
governor's office, I believe.
Yeah, we talked about it at the New Trier Environmental Committee meeting, because they're looking at hopefully getting their first probably step into that would be getting the shuttle bus that runs between the two campuses to be electric, and then that led us to talk about the need for EV charging stations along the route. So yeah, so anyway, that's one thing that could be happening shorter term.
Laura, we're obviously an agricultural heavy state, and water issues aren't only restricted to the Great Lakes. There's a lot of surface water and aquifers involved in the communities within Illinois. What kind of thoughts do you have, or what kind of legislative initiatives are underway to encourage farmers and the agricultural industry to be more environmentally focused and conscious of how they're interacting with our natural systems?
So we do have some legislation that has been introduced this session having to do with conservations. There's a bill called Partners for Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy Act. And this piece of legislation, if I'm correct in the way I'm describing it, would address the state's difficulties in implementing the nutrient loss reduction strategy and add implementation of the strategy to the purpose of the Partners for Conservation Fund. This would provide additional resources in order to implement the strategy, because we know that the runoff is happening and we're seeing this happen. So what can we do to prevent it? Some other pieces of legislation that we have passed, we are banning a piece of legislation passed the Senate that would ban the use of PFAS from getting into our waterways, and other pieces of agriculture legislation. It's quite interesting. I can't remember the name of the organization that represents the farms. They have a program called Adopt a Legislator. And I know personally, I live in the suburbs. I do not know much about farming. So about 8 years ago, I was adopted by a farm family in Logan County, Illinois. And they bring you out there to learn about farming and working on a farm. So I've actually, driven in the I'm going to call it the wrong thing. I've plowed the fields for corn and been able to sit down and talk to the farmers or what their issues are. And every time a bill comes up that affects farms, my farm families in Logan County will come to me and explain to me how this is going to either help them or hurt them. And I look to them as they are my experts. And what do we need to do to get done to protect farming? But as an environmentalist, I want to make sure that the environment is protected as well. And we have come to some agreements and some disagreements on issues as well. But it's an open dialogue that every legislator who's not from a farming community has a farm family like this, so that we can make the proper decisions when it comes to impacting the farms.
Okay. Jumping back to wind energy, a concern expressed by one of our members, Fleury, is about what happens when wind turbines reach the end of their useful life. Does the legislation, are you aware of, contemplate ensuring that the responsibilities for the turbines, extend through the end of their useful life?
I'm going to have to look in the new formation of the legislation and find out. I don't have an answer to that right now, but that is a really good point. What do we do?
Very good. I'm just looking around the group to see if anybody else wanted to raise their hand. They have a question. Looks like Eleanor, you have, and Chuck has a question. Eleanor, why don't you go first, and Chuck, you follow.
All of us pay for energy for our homes, and there is the carrier and then the source of energy. So my carrier is ComEd, and the source of energy I've been using for the last 4 or 5 years is Clean Choice. But I was informed by Faith and Place that Clean Choice Energy is not really using currently clean energy, but they are under involved with legislation for clean energy. So I would like to know, is there a way that I can actually find a source of clean energy when I pay for my home?
So I would recommend going to CUB. Back in the day when we can all meet together, I would yearly have a meeting and bring CUB in and have people bring their electric bills. And CUB would go through your electric bill to tell you, one, are you paying too much? And two, is this the right source of energy that you're looking for? And they will, if you call them up now or go on their website, they will happily guide you in the right direction. Because, and many people, and I actually got caught in this too, you have a provider come to your door and say, oh, it's going to be so cheap for this long, we're going to encourage you to purchase your energy from us, and you change your energy plan. And then, 5 years later, you realize you're paying 4 times as much as everyone else is. And this is something that CUB can point out to you as well. They ended up saving me a lot of money after I found that out.
Well, it's not the money that I'm saving that I'm concerned about. It's actually using a source of clean energy. That's what concerns me.
Yeah, and they'll be able to let you know if that provider is really a source of clean energy.
Chuck, you want to go?
Yep. We've been discussing in our environmental commission the use of pesticides in Winnetka to eliminate mosquito incursion. Mm-hmm. And we understand that we cannot regulate that because there's a law that says only the state can regulate the use of pesticides. And of course, it was passed by the pesticide industry to prevent us from actually doing this. And we're wondering to what extent is the legislature aware of this issue of, protecting one's property against mosquitoes and then killing all the pollinators around your neighborhood in the process?
Absolutely. So Robin Gable and I are actually working on a piece of legislation that focuses on just this issue. And this came from actually an 11-year-old girl in the community.
We know her.
Right, who's in Winnetka?
Yes.
And she's actually, Laura, she's actually the student representative on our environmental commission. Our village president, when she's spectacular, right? When he met her a year and a half ago, he's like, she's coming. She's coming. Look out.
And she's going to change the world.
She is.
So this bill is in the House right now, and Robin is working on it, and we are hitting some roadblocks. Industry is very powerful, unfortunately, but we're going to eventually get there. And this is one of those bills where, like the coal tar bill, isn't going to take a year. It could probably take a little bit longer than that, but we will eventually get it done.
So on that point, Robin, when you say hitting roadblocks because of the barriers that industry is trying to erect, how can we help? How can we help as individuals and as a faith community help remove those kinds of roadblocks?
There are many ways. We have to use our voices. First, we have to educate our friends and neighbors, and then our friends and neighbors have to contact their legislators if there is a bill that they see as important. It's interesting because when it comes to environmental legislation, you guys could call me all you want. I'm on your side. But it's really good for me to have those emails and phone calls. I save every email I have ever received. So if I am fighting for a piece of legislation, let's say it is on pollinators, and industry comes out and says, well, we can't do this, I can say, well, I've heard from 2,000 people in my community who say, oh, yes, you can. So that really gives me kind of a hammer to say, this has got to get done because this is what's important to people in my community. Mm-hmm. That being said, we have to make sure that people in other communities reach out to their legislators as well. When a bill comes to a committee for a hearing, there's a way that everybody can go on and file what's called a witness slip. Mm-hmm. And it's a slip that says, I am in favor of this bill or I am opposed to this bill. And whenever a bill is brought in front of committee, the witness slips are read into the record. So let's say it is this pollinator legislation. They might say, we have 7,281 proponents of the bill and 3 opponents of the bill. And that sends a really strong message to people who are sitting on the committee that this is a bill that's important because a lot of people are focused on this legislation and we have to get it done for our state. So there are many ways people can participate. A personal letter versus an email that you just have to put your name on and click and send is always a little bit more powerful. And you're going to get somebody's attention just a little bit more as a result of that. And hopefully then we will act. Environmental legislation is a huge focus right now. So many people, because we are talking about social justice and economic justice with this, people who were not interested in environmental legislation now are, because they are coming to realize it's not just clean air and clean water. It hits every aspect of our state when it comes to economics and children and healthcare and education and jobs. It's everywhere. And so we've got to, now that it's in the spotlight, we've got to keep our, foot on the electric pedal to keep ourselves moving forward.
Very good. Other questions? Eleanor again?
Okay, I know several years ago, you and Robin Gable were working on some legislation to clear avenues or for power lines to come from other states with renewable energy. And I'm just wondering, are you still working on that? And is this part of CEJA? So could you tell me something about that, please?
So there are many times where we will have legislation in all different types when it comes to energy or job sector or healthcare. Many people introduce pieces of legislation. And what will happen is we'll put together something called an omnibus bill. And they'll say, that's a great piece of legislation on its own, but we're putting together a big piece of legislation on energy. So we're going to include that in that energy legislation and have that be part of the total package. So what will happen is you'll see sometimes a really good bill might be introduced and you'll say, well, why is that bill not moving? Well, it might not be moving on its own but it might be being put in a larger package of legislation. Or they might be trying to kill that piece of legislation and want to keep it out. So it really depends on what it is. But that particular bill would be something that we look at in CETA.
Thank you.
Hi, Liz. I see your
Laura.
hand.
Thanks. Thanks for calling on me. I have a follow-up question about the wind turbine, the task force that you and Robin worked on a couple years ago. Just curious, big picture, is it like, did your sort of research show that it's something that could happen? It's a question of timing. CEJA seems to be, CEJA's clearly focused more on solar, but you said there could be wind. It's obviously, what's interesting to me is wind, typically, it's obviously less known and less used as an energy source, but it's actually number one on the list of, or like number two on the list of things we can do to make a difference to reverse climate change. It's more impactful than solar. So why is there that disconnect, and sort of what's the opportunity moving forward with wind in Illinois in general? Big picture.
You know, I'm going to have to look to see where the task force is right now, because I know I asked to be put on that task force. I don't know that the task force has actually been met yet. So I'm going to have to follow up and see where that is.
Okay, cool. Again,
many
long-term.
things obviously got put on the back burner because of COVID, and
For
this
sure.
was one of them.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, you mentioned that a personal letter is better than a click and send. And I'm wondering, is an email better than a personal letter? It's a little quicker. But
Yeah, it could be a personal letter and an email.
okay.
It doesn't have to necessarily have a stamp and, you know,
Okay.
go by snail mail.
Thank you.
That's totally fine. And that really does have an impact. And it also, those letters can be used to educate. And when somebody has a personal story that goes along with it, that's something that really sticks with somebody. Because somebody can tell me that, you know, green energy is good, green energy is good. Well, great, green energy is good. But when somebody tells me how green energy has impacted their life, you know, I have a child who suffers from asthma. And because of the fact that you can no longer use gas-powered leaf blowers in my community, she's breathing better. That has an impact. That tells you what this legislation can do for somebody.
Thank you.
I see Eleanor's got her hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, through the League of Women Voters and also through Go Green around Winnetka and Go Green, Kenilworth, we do get an opportunity to use witness slips. But I'm wondering, would an email, if we know about a bill that's coming up, would an email hold as much weight as a witness slip?
So I'm going to say both are equally as important. You might find out about a piece of legislation before I do. There were, I think, 4,000 bills that were introduced in the General Assembly this year. So if somebody emails me and says, hey, this bill is coming up, I want you to keep your eye out for it, I'm going to look up that piece of legislation. Especially if it's a bill coming from the House and we're focusing on Senate bills right now, I might not even know about it, but then you're going to put it on my radar screen. So that's important to notify your legislator, but that witness slip is also important to notify that committee that, you know, I might be on or I might not be on, but it's important to have your voice heard in both sides.
Thank you.
Jeffrey,
I
I'm gonna
must say,
defer back.
Laura, you have given us so many guidelines as to how we can assist with legislation here in the state of Illinois. And I think I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I appreciate the help, because when they say, you know, it takes a village, it does. I mean, and coal tar is a great example of that, because I have my communities behind me talking about how important this legislation is. And when industry saw that we had communities that were banning it on their own, they saw the train left the station, and they either have to work with me or the train's just going to run right over them. And it's so powerful to have that support. And it means a lot to a legislature to know that their community is really backing what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, we have that ban against coal tar on our driveways in Winnetka and Kenilworth. The problem is enforcing it, and also keeping that information about the negative qualities of coal tar before the public. So
Right.
it's a constant job.
It is. And I know many of the communities, many of the Go Green groups and the League of Women Voters are really kind of putting pressure on their communities for the enforcement, because it's all being locally enforced, and in many places it's not. And how do we make sure that those rules are being put in place?
And on that issue, and Laura, you were part of this sort of summit that the leaf blower summit. There were many, Beth Drucker and Go Green Wilmette and King Poor, a former trustee, and Winnetka put together this summit, met 2 weeks ago. They're doing a follow-up meeting. There's a lot of really good energy around this too, Eleanor. And happily, it's not just around the enforcement, right? Nobody wants the stick approach. So actually, our chief of police, Mark Hornstein, was in on this meeting, and they're putting together like a pledge to get companies to commit to not doing it and making it more collaborative. So there's really a great conversation going on around this, Eleanor. I'm happy to rope you in on it. It's really exciting. There's some good stuff going.
It is. And what I found so wonderful about that meeting was the variety of people who participated.
Right.
And, you know, the fact that they're putting together this pledge too, it says a lot. Nobody wants to punish somebody for something they don't know about. But we want to make sure we can educate people so they know why they're doing something and the importance of it.
Right. And the conversation around leaf blowers has expanded too, Eleanor, beyond, like, again, the noise and to the health issues, the breathing, and again, the equity issues. Like, who would be ticketed? Who would the enforcement go against? It shouldn't be against the employees who are doing their job and have no say in what their employers or their employers' clients are telling them to do or not to do. So that's one of the questions that's being addressed, is making sure it's an equitable system and that the burdens aren't falling on the people doing the work who have no say in the decision in the first place.
Thank you so much, State Senator Laura Fine, for being with us. I always think that building these relationships are so important, especially with state legislators, because we're closer to you, you're closer to us than members of Congress are. And yet you're in a position where you can be very effective in making important changes. So let's keep the conversation going as the months and years continue. This concludes a 5-week series on environmental justice that we've had for spiritual enrichment, starting at the beginning of April, Earth Month. Thank you to all the members of the Green Team, including Liz and Steve, the co-chairs. The environment is one of our church's 4 commitments to living our faith in the world, joined with LGBTQ, anti-racism, and interfaith work. And sometimes these threads come together, especially with environmental justice. We have the environment and anti-racism coming together, and interfaith, as we had our program last week on Earth Day with representatives of many different faiths. Again, Senator Fine, gracias.
Laura, thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for focusing on this. It's so important.